Readings first from the Old Testament from the prophet Micah, and the heading for the chapter is Promised Ruler from Bethlehem. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. Those origins are from old, from ancient times. Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labour bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. He will stand and shepherd his flock, and in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach the ends of the earth. And he will be our peace when the Assyrians invade our land and march through our fortresses. We will raise against them 7 shepherds, even 8 commanders. And then from the Gospel of Luke, the birth of Jesus as recorded in chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judah, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. In this is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, this morning's message, I was in two minds about what to call it: the long and winding road, or the title I've given here, the long setup, or little town of Bethlehem. But they all converge on the same spot, because the story that we have here, the Christmas story, the story that celebrates the birth of Christ. By the way, the word Christ is the same word as Messiah, just in 2 different languages. It means the one God has chosen to be the King of the world, to lead humanity back to the light. That's really what Christ means. Anyway, there's a long setup to the coming of the Messiah, to the coming of the true King. And there are a lot of elements that have to be put in place. It's extremely complicated. And in fact, if you've ever read the Bible from cover to cover, I think you'll agree it's a complicated book. And it's not the sort of book you sit down and knock over in a couple of hours. But it's a kind of book that doesn't make sense, and it ends up just being a shaggy dog story if you don't see all the bits and pieces and how they all come together. And at the centre of the story is Jesus. Jesus, who is the Christ, and the coming of that one. Because the entire Old Testament is a big, long setup. It's a long and winding road, or a long setup that brings us to this place. Now, I'm going to give credit for this illustration I'm going to give now to my son Max. My son Max is studying at university, and studying at university. I've seen him study. Doesn't look very hard to me. I remember when they said when I was at doing year 12 that, tertiary education will be the hardest years of your life. Well, that's just not true. Anyway, he's studying literature and that sort of thing, and playwriting and so on. And one of the concepts he introduced me to was this idea called Chekhov's gun. Now, if anyone who's studied literature will probably be familiar with Chekhov's gun. Now, Chekhov was a Russian playwright, Anton Chekhov, and he famously wrote that every element in a story must be necessary, and all irrelevant elements should be removed. Elements should not appear to make false promises by never coming into play. You see, that's why shaggy dog stories are so annoying, because they've got lots of elements in it that look like they're going to pay off, and they don't. And that's why we hate those shaggy dog stories. Because the setup, there's no payoff. So Chekhov says it makes the false promise of being, concerning this shaggy dog story, the shaggy dog story makes the false promise of being funny and introduces irrelevant details spun out over a long story with no payoff in the end. So to avoid that, Chekhov gave advice to young playwrights that if a gun is placed in a scene, it must at some point be used. Therefore, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, then in the second or the third chapter, it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. So never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it's not going to go off. It's wrong to make promises that you don't mean to keep. So that's Chekhov's advice. And this piece of advice is now well known as Chekhov's gun. And here's the thing, the Bible is one of the longest, and perhaps actually the longest, saga ever written. It's spread out over thousands of years, and we're still part of it, still going on. And the entire Bible is full of Chekhov's guns. Guns, 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 absolutely everywhere, loaded and cocked and hanging on every wall, but they don't go off in the first act. They don't go off in the second act or the third or even the fourth. It just seems to be continuous build-up through the whole Old Testament. Setup after setup after setup, but it seems like there's no payoff until you get to the first chapters of the New Testament and suddenly all the guns go off in one big bang. And that one big bang is the coming of the Messiah, because all of those things that were set up, all the little things, all the little subtexts and woven in symphony sort of strains that are in this entire saga all lead to one place, and the whole lot of them all go off synchronized at the same time in the birth of the Messiah. And that brings us to this small town of Bethlehem, just a little village, but it plays a hugely significant role in this entire setup because it is one of the many loaded guns on the long and winding road to the appearance of the Messiah. And it was necessary, it turns out, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem because that was set up in the Old Testament. If our first reading from Micah chapter 5 verses 2 to 4 said, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labour bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. He will stand as a shepherd of his flock in the strength of the Lord and in the majesty of the name of the Lord, his God. And they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth." Now there's so much in that little passage. There's a lot of Chekhov's guns in that little passage. They're too numerous to mention them all, but I'll just bring out a few of them which end up going off. The gun is cocked and loaded and ready to go, and it fires in the birth of Jesus the Messiah. Now, so for instance, he says that Bethlehem is from the clan of Judah. And that goes all the way back to Genesis 49 verse 8, when it says, "Judah, your brothers shall praise you, your hands shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's sons will bow before you." Judah is a lion's cub. And it talks about, I'll skip a few verses, but it talks about Judah being like a lion, a great and powerful lion, a majestic being. And then verse 10 it says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor shall the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of all the people. So right back there in Genesis, it was predicting that someone from the line of Judah would end up being the Messiah, the true king. And then there's another little Chekhov's gun there in that passage. It says, Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labour bears a son. Now, it's really interesting that from the time, if you know a little bit about Israel's history, you'll know that they went into exile because they had chose not to worship the true God, and they had abandoned God and worshipped idols. They ended up being taken into exile. And there was a prediction at that time that God would leave Israel to their own devices for a period of over 520 years. In fact, there's another prediction in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel predicted that after the exile there would be a further 490 years would pass before the Messiah would be born. So Daniel predicted the Messiah would be born 490 years after the announcement that Israel would be rebuilt. Now here's the thing. Right at the time of Christ, it was 490 years. So the timing was perfect. The time was right. And God had abandoned Israel. If you know about Israel's history, when they came to dedicate the temple, the Spirit didn't turn up. They built the second temple, nothing happened. It was like a church service I went to some time ago, I can't remember it now, but nothing happened, as I remember. Well, nothing happened when they dedicated the temple, but God predicted that nothing would happen. And it seemed like Israel had been abandoned, but that's exactly what God told them. It will seem like you're abandoned for a period of time. But then there will come a time when she who is in labour bears a son, and that son will be the Messiah. So this is all, this is all in the lead up, all of these cocked and loaded guns. Isaiah chapter 7 cross-references this by saying, but the Lord will still give you proof. A virgin will become pregnant and she will have a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God's with us. In other words, you won't be abandoned anymore. The period of abandonment will come to an end. It will finish. And then God will step back into Israel's history and God will be with you. 490 years after the announcement that the temple will be rebuilt. So you see, all of these things, all of these guns are all pointing in the same direction. They're all pointing to the same time, the same place. It's all building up. There's a big build-up going on here. Then Isaiah chapter 9, which I read before, about a child. For unto us a child is born, and a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will sit on the throne of David to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from that time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So again, Isaiah is saying that when the Messiah comes, he'll be a true king, and he won't be like the other kings, despotic, narcissistic, self-serving. He will come and he will serve his people and he will bring peace. There are other predictions that it would come during the reign of the Romans. All of these things are all, and I'm only just skimming a rock across the top here. There's a whole bunch of other Chekhov's guns that are all pointing to this same thing. It's a giant setup. And so now we've got a virgin, she's pregnant, and she was told that she would give birth to the Saviour of Israel. That's what the name Jesus means. God saves. Jesus, and he would be the Christ, the one chosen by God to be the true king. She is from the line of David. She's from the tribe of Judah. It's 490 years after the announcement. It's everything is just looking like it's right on cue. But if you've ever read a book or watched a movie that has a ton of tension in it with lots of unresolved loose ends and plot points that have yet to be concluded, but you can see that you've gone that far through the book and you've only got a couple of pages left, and you think, man, they've got to do a lot. They've got to cover a lot of territory in the last few pages. Have you ever had that? Well, that's exactly what was happening in Israel. Israel was thinking, time is moving on. It's 490 years and it still feels like we're abandoned. Where is God? What's he doing? And of course, when you read all of this, you see it's all coming to this conclusion. It's got to tie up somehow. All those loose ends, all those guns have to fire at some point. The tension is palpable. And you've got to understand, back in the time in Israel, everybody was talking about this. This was the talk of the town. You can go back and read Jewish history, and everyone on their Facebook feeds was talking about who the Messiah is. Twitter was just a buzz with it. It was just on. That's all everyone ever talked about. In fact, if you read the gospel stories, you can see Jesus walked right into the middle of all that, and he was claiming to be the Messiah, and they're thinking, really? I thought he'd be taller. That kind of thing. But when we look back at this story, we can see there's only one element missing here, because the stars have perfectly lined up. You know, it's really interesting. I haven't got time to go into it in detail, but there's a constellation called Leo, and at that time you can actually get an app on your phone which shows you what the sky would have looked like, and it actually has a crowning of Leo, which is, the Lion of Judah, is crowned with Regulus. In other words, there was a royal crown coming to sit on the head of Leo. And the astronomers and proto-scientists in Babylon, the wise men, were looking at the sky and going, something's going on. I reckon the Messiah's been born. It's the right time. They knew the scriptures. 490 years, all happening. So they head off. And it's in the time of the Romans, as predicted by Daniel. The virgin is pregnant and has had it announced to her that she would give birth to the Messiah. There's only one little piece of this whole jigsaw missing, and that is Bethlehem, because the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But Mary is in Nazareth. And if you know anything about Jewish history, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. But then here's a Gentile king steps in and changes the course of history. In those days, Luke chapter 2, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And that resulted in Joseph and Mary leaving Nazareth, going to Bethlehem at just the right time. I don't know if you've ever seen that great Christmas movie. What's it called? Die Hard? And there's a bit where Hans Gruber is needing something to be done to unlock the vault, but he needs outside help. He needs someone to shut off the power from outside. And they think, we can't shut off the power from inside the building. What are we going to do? And he says, don't worry. And then the FBI turn up and they turn off the power. He says, I give you the FBI. And they unwittingly did his bidding. Well, here is Caesar as unwittingly doing the bidding of God and sending Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem so that all the scriptures can come to pass, and then bang! All the guns go off. And all of those converging plot lines find their conclusion in the birth of Jesus. And it's not just the conclusion of Israel's history, it's the conclusion of world history, because if this is true, if Jesus is the one chosen and anointed by God to be King of the world, that means that there is hope. That one day Jesus will stand in the second advent, where he will stand on the earth and he will be the true King, the true Lord, not like all the other kings and lords who've come in plenty in every philosophical system and kind of government which has come and gone. Kingdoms come, kingdoms go, kings rise up and then they die. Great systems come, even democracy is starting to fall apart now. There's only one hope, and that is the true King, a good King, a just King, a generous King, and that King is Jesus. For it says in Micah, and I'll end with this, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And that's where Australia gets a mention in the Bible. Here we are, worshipping the King on the day when we literally call it the celebration that Jesus is the King. And here we are at the ends of the earth, doing exactly as was predicted. Chekhov's gun just went off again. And we are partly fulfilling that great commission that Jesus would be the King of the world. Yes, there's many people who haven't bowed the knee to him, but for those who do, there is joy So joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. And I urge you, receive your King this morning. Let's sing together, joy to the world, the Lord is come.